personalized medicine is really helping us get to where we are treating you, the individual, rather than the sort of common denominator.
If you go to your doctor and they're not looking at your DNA and they don't understand your environment and they're looking at your symptoms and all they want to do is give you a pill, run away.
Without that information, somewhere between a third or half, sometimes up to 3/4 of people will not benefit, and in many cases may even be harmed from these kinds of medications.
Well, the idea that we can prevent so many medical errors and deaths due to medical errors and prolonged misery people endure from not being diagnosed properly, all that is incredible. There are brand new medical practices that are changing the game. Cutting edge tests and diagnostics that are allowing medical practitioners to completely revolutionize the way we think about healthcare. Tailoring treatments to exactly what you need, but the mainstream US healthcare system does not have the time nor the resources to provide this to you. But we at Rebel Health Alliance, we are doing this now. Hey everybody, I'm Jack Murphy and we are back. I am the co-founder of Rebel Health Alliance and the co-host of our show here with Dr. Deep, my co-founder and co-host. Dr. Deep, how are you doing today, buddy?
I am great, Jack. Great to see you again. Excited to talk about a pretty interesting topic here today, precision medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the kind of thing that is just mind-blowing when you learn about it. And then it's kind of disheartening when you understand that the medical practice traditionally right now is just not even talking about, much less implementing all these amazing things that we're going to talk about in the future. These are things that are going to completely revolutionize the way that you receive healthcare. Instead of getting generic cookie cutter, one size fits all factory widget style healthcare in the future for everyone else. But for today, right now with Rebel Health Alliance, you're going to get precision, customized healthcare and a medical plan that is going to get you looking and feeling your best in no time flat. All right, Dr. Deep, let's get started here. Can you explain to our viewers what personalized medicine is and how it differs from traditional approaches?
Sure, Jack. You know, the traditional healthcare system doesn't suit any of us. I think we all know that. We go into our primary care doc, we get something like 10 minutes to chat with them, and we get thrown a medication. And that approach is obviously not going to understand the full context of our lives, from our lifestyles and our diets and our family relationships. But even deeper than that, we have a lot of information now on how our bodies actually work and operate, down to the genomic DNA sort of cellular kind of level. So the real principles of personalized and precision medicine is that we're all individuals. Studies that are done on all of these medications and therapeutics, they tend to be done on populations. And we're always asking ourselves as physicians, does this study seem like the same kind of patients as I'm treating right now? And often the answer is no, for a whole myriad of reasons. So precision and personalized medicine is really helping us get to an N of one, where we are treating you, the individual, rather than the sort of common denominator baseline.
That sounds incredible. And it's actually kind of terrifying to think that with all of the unique variations, myriad variations and differences between us and everyone else, you know, we're all just snowflakes, right? That you would go in and get healthcare and it would be something that's basically addressed to the entire population instead of addressed to you. And there are got to be a million different ways in which that could actually be completely harmful to you, Deep. Before we get into the rest of it, are there not circumstances in which your genetic makeup would preclude you from receiving certain procedures, you know, medications, diets, even that people just are blanket prescribing to people?
Yeah, absolutely, Jack. And, you know, a typical example that folks talk about in sort of the precision medicine world is around cancer. And, yeah, there's a scary stat out there, which we'll show later on as well. Around 75% of cancer therapeutics don't actually work on the specific individual that they are given to, because most of the time their genetic makeup is not the same as the folks who were in those studies. And so, if you look at figure 1 here, the traditional medicine versus precision medicine often is talked about in this realm where we're thinking about radiation or chemotherapy or surgery. These are our standard treatments that we have for something like a lung cancer, for example. Yet what we know is that each person's specific genetic makeup, the actual genetic makeup of the tumor itself, whether it has certain receptors or what kind of enzymes it's working with, all have an impact on the kind of medications we can use. So you can see here on the right side, as we start to understand someone's genetics and how they may respond to various immunotherapies, we can get very targeted now in treating these kinds of individuals. When you back up a little bit, outside of cancer, which most of us thankfully are not experiencing, we still see this play out in all the routine kind of ways. I was a primary care physician in a sort of traditional practice for many years. Most primary care docs in this country have something like 2,500 to 5,000 patients that they are responsible for. And when you have that many folks and you have this 10 minutes sort of per visit, you really can't get deep and really understand what's going on with patients. And so, I'll give you an example. I had a 45-year-old lady, Janet, who I was seeing in my clinic. And she came in with a lot of vague type symptoms, things like fatigue and weight gain over the past 18 months. And it's challenging to sort of tease through a lot of that when you have 4 patients sort of waiting for you next, and you're not exactly sure, where to start. And oftentimes this ends up in patients just receiving a medication, giving it a shot for a few weeks or months, and then sort of coming back. And so that's what we did. And unfortunately, this patient continued to kind of cycle through without having any improvement in any of her symptoms, despite several different kinds of medications and treatments that we tried. We weren't actually getting to the root of the problem. This patient is actually someone who's come over and followed us and is now part of our Rebel Health family. And as I have much more time now and able to spend 90 minutes with her in a full conversation, but more importantly, order an entire battery of tests and diagnostics where we look at her genetics, we look at her deep blood work, we look at DEXA scans and actually understand what's going on inside of people's bodies. This all gave us a much deeper picture of what was going on. We actually realized she had a very significant hormone and vitamin imbalance. And once we were able to correct those, her symptoms that she was suffering from for many years at this point have all really improved, and thankfully so. But had she stayed with sort of the traditional healthcare system, as many of us are forced to do, we're not able to get that level of insight for folks. And unfortunately, we see the outcomes play out like that throughout healthcare every single day.
All right, so let me get this straight. Janet goes to see a doctor who's seeing 2,000 patients all at once. She gets a 15-minute appointment, and the doctor is already handling just an enormous amount of other patients, really just prescribes her quickly antidepressant or just whatever, just after a quick discussion. Over the next 6 months, she returns multiple times to see the doctor. Each time it costs her like $200 a visit almost. And nothing has gotten better for her. In fact, there's probably some negative side effects that come along with being put on an antidepressant. So finally, she reaches out to you at Rebel Health Alliance. And because you're only seeing like a max going to see 400 to 600 patients, you're able to spend 60 to 90 minutes with her. You put her through a whole battery of testing, including genetic tests, blood work, DEXA scan. And instead of it telling you that she was depressed and needs to be on an antidepressant, it tells you that she's got a vitamin deficiency and she's got hormone issues.
Yep.
And these are things that can be resolved very quickly and easily. And then once she got that, like magic, the depression went away. That's incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, too many of us in healthcare are just kind of throwing medications at symptoms rather than understanding the real root cause. And often we don't have the real diagnostics nor the time to interpret those results to put it all together and give people kind of a bespoke, individualized plan. Again, an N of one plan just for her, for Janet, rather than the population that we're serving.
Okay, so that's incredible. So we're talking about genetic testing, deep blood work, a DEXA scan, and the analysis reveals a hormonal imbalance, vitamin deficiencies, and we look at her unique genetic makeup, turn that around into dietary changes, supplements, hormone therapy, and all of this really reduces the number of times you have to come to see the doctor. It reduces the time from symptom to resolution, and it greatly improves people's experience and their health outcomes. And this is what a customized, personalized approach can do for you versus just being another widget in the factory, just being another number in a 2,000 person panel. Like, how could you even possibly remember everybody's names or what's important to them or what's been going on? You check the notes and maybe the notes are bad. You don't know what's going on. So this is really the future, and this is something that we're super excited about. And today we're going to talk about these actual specific components of the precision diagnostics and analytics, especially talking about the DNA test. So this is where we're going to get a little bit deeper. We're going to dive right in to the basics of why studying DNA is important, what the test reveals, and how we can apply it. So Deep, let's really just dig down to the basics here. How do DNA and RNA contribute to this individualized approach? Can you take us on a journey that's going to help us understand that?
Sure, Jack. And we'll get pretty technical here because I want folks to really understand why it is important to realize what your DNA is actually showing in order for us to pair that with the right kind of interventions for folks. So let's take a step back into our high school biology class and remember what DNA even is. As you can see in this figure, we're all made up of trillions of cells. Within our cells, we have a nucleus. Inside the nucleus are our chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes as humans, and those chromosomes are tightly woven structures of DNA. DNA was discovered back in the 50s, the double helix structure by Watson and Crick. There's an interesting story about Francis Crick said after he won the Nobel Prize that he was on LSD when he first sort of conceptualized the structure of the double helix. And it was one of the biggest breakthroughs in all of science to date still. So let's take a step deeper and actually look at what is DNA. So DNA is made up of what we call nucleotides. As you can see in this next figure here, a nucleotide, there are 4 nucleotides that code for DNA, and DNA is the coding mechanism for almost all life on the planet, but certainly for human beings. You see adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine here. Those are the 4 nucleotides that essentially code for all of the variation that we see across all of life, which is pretty remarkable. These DNA strands, these nucleotides, ultimately get translated into RNA, which then create proteins. That's the whole point. This is the blueprint that your body is working off of in order to then construct all of the other basic parts that are needed for your cells and for your organs and organ systems. So you can see in this next figure 4, what we mean by that. These base pairs, what we call these nucleotides, pair together. Adenine and thymine pair together, and cytosine and guanine paired together. And those combinations, just these 64 combinations of 4 nucleotides, code for all of the individuality we see across human beings. Codes for about 80,000 different kind of combinations that can form all sorts of different proteins in our bodies. So let's look at figure 5. One of the things that is really important to understand is this idea of a single nucleotide polymorphism, these SNPs. That's what you hear a lot of folks talk about when we're actually looking at the genetic tests, or what are the various SNPs that we are trying to understand. What a SNP is essentially if you were to swap out one of these pairs, one of these letters for a different letter. And these are mutations that happen naturally. Mutations are not bad. Mutations are what lead to, genetic variability, and, survival of the fittest is often because we have mutated some gene that's then coded a advantageous protein or factor for us. Some of these mutations don't actually do anything. If you swap one letter out, as we showed, there may be redundancy, and you're just creating the same exact protein. In those cases, we don't really care about those SNPs. What we care about is when a single nucleotide polymorphism actually changes the structure of the protein that we're actually coding for. So you can see in this next figure, when we're talking about something like sickle cell, it takes one letter off, coding in the beta globulin area of our red blood cells, that changes a protein from glutamic acid into valine. And that single polymorphism causes the entire disease of sickle cell. And this is a devastating disease for many folks. Your red blood cells are not the nice sort of circular donut shape. They are sickle shaped, and they end up causing all sorts of vaso-occlusion and strokes and pain syndromes and all sorts of terrible things. And that all tracks back to one single mutation in one letter across all of the various chromosomes that we have. We can understand now how important DNA is to the structure of life.
So wait, I'm trying to do all the math in my head here. Like, how many SNPs are there? Like, how many different things are there for people to look at when they're doing a DNA analysis? Is it just 64? Is it 128? Like, what are we talking about here?
There are millions of different SNPs, and that's where this gets very complicated. The Human Genome Project was completed in the 90s, early 2000s, I think, and that's really what mapped out every single one of the nucleotide base pairs in the human chromosome. And we're still unpacking a lot of that. There are a lot of areas that we don't know, whether these are coding portions of our DNA or non-coding portions, what those SNPs may end up doing to us as far as the phenotypic expression of how human beings actually experience life. And so as we'll understand more and see further on, these SNPs are the basis of many of the diseases that we see. But thankfully, they are also the basis of many of the treatments and the advanced therapeutics that.
All right, but let me interrupt you for a second. Our DNA is the code. Are they always turned on? Is the DNA going to express itself the same way all the time? How are the genes regulated? Like, tell me, like, I don't understand any of this stuff really, because I'm not sure that I do. That's why we've got you, Dr. Deep. Is your DNA like your destiny? Is this going to are you just fixed in place once you're born and the DNA is all set, or how does that work?
Well, I'll say yes and no. In some ways, I think there's a lot more to understand about our genetics than we give it credit for. And, as I said, we're still unpacking many of the millions and millions of different base pairs and what that might mean as far as human disease or human benefit even. There are certainly features. When we talk about epigenetics, there are things that can turn on and turn off different genes in our environment, even things like sunlight or being exposed to certain emotions like love with your children. All of these things have been actually shown to modulate genomic expression at the DNA level. And I think we're still understanding a lot about this science and how those kinds of things work. There are studies that even show, young kids that play in the dirt and garden and touch plants can turn on certain genes that had laid dormant that may, help them process information and learn. And so we will continue to see, Jack, all sorts of really interesting things in this space where we are using the genetic code as our blueprint and able to use our environment and other external stimuli as this epigenetic sort of overlay, turn off or turn on different expression of different genes.
Okay, so that's mind blowing. So basically, you're telling me that we're all coded up. We've got good genes and bad genes and things that help us and things that hurt us, but there are ways that we can interact with our environment. We can set our environment. We can change our environment to change the way that our DNA is expressed in our body. I think the word you used was phenotype. Is that right? Like the expression of the genes in your body is something that we can control and manipulate through our environment. So maybe when we look around at like the obesity epidemic, maybe there's something in the environment that's triggering something in our DNA that's causing this expression of obesity in people all across the country. And in fact, all across the globe when you look at the numbers. And it's very fascinating to think that we're not just completely stuck in one spot. We can manipulate this to our advantage. So there's also, as far as I understand it too, your genes are going to dictate the way that you interact with certain medicines, whether or not you process them at a quicker rate, metabolize them more quickly, or whether they're even effective, or if you need a higher dose or a lower dose, or if certain diets are going to turn on, your propensity for neurodegenerative disease, for example. So if you go to your doctor and they're not looking at your DNA and they don't understand your environment, and they're looking at your symptoms and all they want to do is give you a pill, go run away. You are in the wrong place. And unfortunately, that's where everybody is stuck right now. Not everybody. There's a select few of you who have figured it out and seen the light, and you can join us. But I really feel bad, honestly. I'm up at night thinking about the substandard, even possibly detrimental care that people are receiving in your traditional healthcare system when all these tools are available, but there is just a myriad of factors keeping doctors from doing the test, running the test, understanding the science, and talking to you about their results. I remember very clearly asking a physician's assistant at One Medical like 15 years ago or 12 years ago or something, I'd love to get my testosterone tested. I don't feel good. And she goes, why? What would I do with the information that I get? And times have changed a little bit when it comes to male sex hormones, but that was like bowled me over. She just did. I was like, okay, I gotta go somewhere else. And that was when this kind of information was only available in the depths of the internet. Like TRT was only something talked about on the deep fringes. And actually that's like a pattern that we see, right? The internet is amazing for that because it can take edge cases and edge studies and edge science and process it and experiment with it. And the bros experiment with it, and crazy doctors who are willing to entertain new ideas, experiment with it. And eventually the good stuff percolates and gets sucked into the center, but not at a rate quick enough to really do any widespread benefit, as we can see with our just worsening healthcare crisis day by day by day. So let us talk now about how this really works in reality, right? Do you have a real world case study that you can share with me where this precision analysis in conjunction to DNA tests, along with like a blood panel that your average doctor is not going to order you, and a whole number of other tests, you got your DEXA tests, DEXA scans, which analyze your body composition and bone density and visceral fat versus general fat, at visceral versus adipose. There we go. Adipose? No. Visceral versus which?
Subcutaneous.
See, this is why we've got the doctor here. All these things work together to come up with like a real precision plan. So do you have an example that we can walk our listeners through so they can see how this would relate to them in their real world application, their day-to-day life?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a patient right now, 45-year-old young woman. She's doing great in a lot of ways, but has had a lot of symptoms of fatigue, insomnia, some weight gain, abnormal periods, some hair growth, and no one's really been able to figure it out. She's been to doctor after doctor. They've thrown different medications at her, done some, little testing here and there, but no one's really gone deep to try to understand what's happened. Part of our standard offering is getting a genetic test and a pretty deep blood profile on all of our patients. In this patient's case, we also got something called a Dutch test, which we can actually measure all sorts of different things, such as estrogen metabolites, testosterone metabolites, your cortisol levels, and you sort of do this over the course of 24 hours, collect various urine samples, and that gives us a much deeper picture, real time, of what's happening in someone's body. And so what we realized when we did this patient's blood test and Dutch test is that she was not able to metabolize one of the byproducts of estrogen. When estrogen breaks down, in order for it to leave the system, we have to do two things. We have to do something called hydroxylation, where we add an OH group to it, and then we have to methylate that byproduct. Only through those two mechanisms can the body then excrete those harmful byproducts. If those byproducts build up in your system, they can cause many of the symptoms that I sort of described. So what we noticed in this patient is not only did her Dutch test show that she had high levels of these metabolites, we then looked at her genetic test, which actually confirmed to us that she had a variant in two genes, her COMT gene and her MTHFR gene, both of which help to methylate those byproducts, like I said. Because of that variant and that defect, she was getting stuck kind of halfway through the pathway of metabolizing out her estrogens. And that has sort of built up in her system, likely causing many of these symptoms. What we were able to do then is pair her with the right kind of diet that can help us to methylate appropriately, put her on the right kind of supplements that also help with that sort of methylation piece. And we're starting to see many of her symptoms improve dramatically, significantly, in a way that she's never experienced for a decade now. She's been suffering from a lot of these symptoms. But had we not gone deep and understood what was going on in her blood, what was going on in her urine, what was going on at the cellular DNA level, we would not have been able to come up with the appropriate treatment plan. And your typical primary care doctor doesn't really even have the time or often the experience to put all that data together and really come up with this sort of individualized plan. So there's one sort of clear example of how we were able to use each of these different diagnostics to help this patient.
That's incredible. That blows my mind. I have been to the doctor so many times. I've sat down and gone over a list of symptoms, and I have never once got a DNA test. I've never once got the Dutch test. I don't know if that even applies to men, but I've never even got anything beyond the basic, blood panel that you get. Take my blood pressure, take my temperature, maybe ask me a couple questions about my lifestyle, and then you're just on your way. My wife is a hairdresser, and she tells me that these women that she cuts hair, they're all in their like 40s and 50s. And she says the common story she hears from them is that they go and talk to their doctor, and the doctor just says, "Oh, that's hormone problems for you." And then that's it. And that's the end of the story for them. And it's just like something that they have to live with. But what you're telling me here is that through DNA, through the blood work, through this Dutch test, through actually listening to the story that this woman is telling you, that you are able to solve a lot of these problems that afflict so many women of her age and her condition. What do you think the impact of this precision analysis is going to be on general treatment outcomes? Is it going to solve any problems that we see in existing healthcare? Is it going to reduce errors? Is it going to reduce death? Like, what is the benefit going to be to the population at large?
So let me give you a startling stat. The fifth leading cause of death in this country is medication errors. Over 100,000 people a year die from medication errors. Some of those are just, wrongly dosed medications, but many of those are medications that are given to people that don't have the right genetic makeup for that kind of medication. Here's a few stats. A third of patients will not respond to an SSRI that you put them on for depression. 50% of patients will not respond to certain diabetic medications based on their genes. And 75% of cancer therapeutics will not work on certain patients based on their genes. Yet, without that information, we use sort of the population guidelines and standards of care that we talked about earlier and apply that broadly to everyone, knowing full well that somewhere between a third or half, sometimes up to 3/4 of people will not benefit, and in many cases may even be harmed from these kinds of medications.
All that is incredible. The idea that we can prevent so many medical errors and deaths due to medical errors and prolonged misery people endure from not being diagnosed properly through using advanced technology, new processes, new procedures, new analytics, and basically, evolving our thinking as medical, well, not we, but you guys evolving your thinking as medical professionals. And I want to talk about the future of things. But before we get there, I just wanted to ask you a personal question.
Sure, Jack.
Knowing, and I'm not saying that you led anybody off to a terrible demise, but just thinking about your profession in general, what does it feel like knowing now what we know now versus the past, and looking back on the treatments that were applied to people or the system that you were involved in? How does it feel now looking back on that experience? And then also tell me, how does it feel looking forward into these amazing new technologies?
Look, I think every doctor is trying to do their best with the information they have and the patient in front of them. The system is not set up to allow us to actually understand people at a deep sort of genetic level, personal level, understanding what's actually happening in their body. We make a lot of leaps of faith as we are seeing patients, as we mentioned before, applying broad strokes of what we've sort of come to understand to the person in front of us rather than the other way around, which is the way it really should be. And so, I think back to many of the patients I've seen in my life, and certainly the ones that have had poor outcomes. And I wonder what could have been had they been with a practice like ours. What could have been had they understood what was going on at the cellular level, at the genomic level in their lives? Would we have been able to pair the right kind of treatments for their advanced cancer, or given them the right SSRI or antidepressant before they committed suicide? These are heartbreaking stories where we understand now that we probably could have done much better for that patient. And while I think, a decade or two ago, we could have made the excuse that these kinds of diagnostics were not widely available, so therefore we don't have that kind of information at our fingertips, that's certainly changing now. We have consumer-directed tests that as low as $100 for some, very cheap basic things. Ours is $500, but covers 800,000 different SNPs like we talked about, and you get all these different kind of individualized reports. Actually we're starting to see a bright spot here as well. And while I, have been pretty vocal in my disdain for much of pharma, I do believe that one of the next waves that we will see is something called or companion diagnostics, where the pharma company essentially sells you a individualized DNA test for this specific medication before you start the medication, so that you know which variant you're treating with this certain person, and you can choose the right kind of therapeutic for that. So I have great hope and optimism going into the future that will start to become the standard of care. Just as we now look at someone's labs and vitals and other comorbidities to understand whether a particular medication is indicated or contraindicated, we will then add in things like, our genome as well in that equation to help us make those kinds of decisions.
I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyer inside of me was just thinking, man, if the pharmaceutical companies have at their disposal currently, which they do, a DNA test which can analyze the efficacy of their drug and whether or not it may even be harmful to you before you take it, and they're not making you do that, I don't know. That sounds like some negligence or some malpractice, something not so good, honestly.
There's cost, there's privacy and the ethical concerns. There's people, willing to give up that kind of information about their body as well. And so there are many barriers to something like that, Jack. But I definitely agree. I think we will certainly look back and say we harmed people by not understanding this kind of information about them before, especially giving them different kinds of therapeutics or not giving them certain kinds of medications.
Yeah, indeed. Well, at least the future is bright. And, you get to look back. I've been reading about like Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, and thinking back about the medical treatment that people got back then. Look, it's always going to be a process. We're always evolving, but at least find a doctor who's committed to the process of evolution, who's committed to the process of adopting new and better techniques and trying to get, the best care possible to the patient. Deep, where do you see this stuff going in the future? Like, what are some interesting things that you see on the horizons? Let's run through a couple of them real quick here.
Yeah, I think there's two big things that stand out to me, Jack. One is going to be whole genome sequencing. So we talked about the Human Genome Project. That was the first project that actually looked at every single chromosome and every single different SNP. And we're still, again, trying to understand everything about that. Most of the commercial DNA tests that we get are actually not looking at your whole genome. They're targeting very specific genes or SNPs that we're trying to understand about you. Ours is very comprehensive, like we mentioned, over 800,000 SNPs, but even that doesn't come close to the number of variations that could be occurring in our chromosome. So as the technology gets better and as the unit price keeps dropping, we will see commercially available whole genome sequencing for patients at scale. And that's going to give us a whole new set of data. Now we think about LLMs and AI and what those kinds of tools can do with this amount of data. It's going to be fascinating to see what kind of insights come from this. I think one of the coolest things is a technology called CRISPR. You may have heard of this, but for one of those single nucleotide polymorphisms, CRISPR is a technology that essentially can go into your DNA and your cells and pick out that exact single SNP and replace it. And that's crazy when you think about it. Like, we're living in sci-fi world. We mentioned sickle cell anemia previously, where one nucleotide being off in your entire genome of millions can cause these devastating effects and this devastating disease. Well, a couple of weeks ago, the FDA approved the first gene editing CRISPR-based medication technology to treat sickle cell, where we literally go in, replace that one letter with the correct letter that it should be, and the trials are all showing unbelievable results. Literally, patients who have suffered from this condition for decades have been cured, essentially. And I think we will continue to see really interesting applications of this kind of technology. Here's another interesting one you may have heard of. That guy, Brian Johnson, the blueprint guy or whatever, he's gotten a lot of flack for a lot of reasons. But one thing that's interesting to note is he was, he mentioned that he was taking something called the follistatin gene therapy. There's a gene in our body called myostatin, which decreases or places a checkpoint on the amount of muscle that we're able to build. Interestingly, there are subgroups of the population who are deficient in that gene or have a certain variant of it where they do not express myostatin. Therefore, there is no checkpoint. And you see them put on muscle in a very significant way. There are these stories of like the young Hercules, these like 5 and 8 year old kids who are just jacked because they have this myostatin gene variant. So follistatin is a glycoprotein that can essentially block that myostatin and allow us to put on more muscle. And that's what you see Brian Johnson doing as well. I think this raises really interesting sort of ethical considerations as well, which we could talk about later. But, those folks who have access to these kinds of therapies, will we now see sort of a bifurcation in humanity where the folks that can afford it and the folks that can, have the team to actually understand what these medications do and how we actually use them will start to break away because they're really manipulating who they are at the very genomic cellular level. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Gattaca. We just rewatched that the other week. And it's interesting. You see people are essentially all genetically programmed from birth. And those who are not are actually ostracized and they're considered sort of less than everyone else.
Yeah, man, I've seen Gattaca, and it is amazing that they've created these perfect human beings and left people outside of the gene editing community as sort of, shunned lesser thans. And I think that it's actually really portending the future here, because anybody with money and access is going to do these things which are going to improve their genetics and improve their genetic expression. Who wouldn't want to be bigger, taller, stronger? I don't know what other genes are limited in their expression that can be modified that way, but it sounds like you can pretty much go in there and snip away diseases and change your whole composition and become sort of like a superhuman. There are moral and philosophical questions about that. Obviously, whether it's right or wrong, we can leave those aside. But what we can say is for sure it's going to happen. People are going to do it. We are already seeing Mr. Blueprint, Brian Johnson, do it right now with the myostatin, and he's going to turn into that cow that they show pictures of, who looks like he's on 10,000 pounds of steroids every single day.
Mm-hmm.
But he's doing it, and people are going to do it. So there will be a parallel discussion about the morals and the ethical questions, philosophical, spiritual questions around it. But I think it's also just sort of a natural process that's going to occur. And speaking of, dividing the population, we're already seeing that happen today when you can look at between the obese and the non-obese, the metabolically healthy versus the non-metabolically healthy. These divisions are going to get bigger and bigger as the obesity population and the metabolically unhealthy population continues to grow, which means their chronic diseases are going to continue to grow, which means their life expectancy and life health span are going to get worse and deteriorate. And there's people, like our Rebel Health customers and others who are on top of that game, and they're not going to have that type of outcome. And the trends are already so clear that it's going to be a small percentage of people who are healthy and fit and sound, as we still struggle to continue to understand what environmentally has changed that has caused our whole population basically to turn, to get fat when, just 50, 60 years ago, that wasn't the case. And of course, this is a global phenomenon too. So all these things are fascinating. It's really wild new world out there. And while some of these gene editing, elements are probably not going to be relevant for most of you, they're interesting to learn about, interesting to think about. But today we can really bring some of this stuff down to the ground and put it in the hands of people right now. And that's the DNA, that's advanced blood work, that's blood, bone scans, body composition scans, testing your VO2 max, really figuring out where you are and what the issues you are having right now so that we can treat them. And that to me is much more practical and relevant than, are we all going to turn into Supermen in the next 5 to 10 years? Maybe. It's possible, Deep. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, Jack, you bring up a lot of really interesting points, certainly around the philosophical and ethical pieces in this. Even in that movie Gattaca, one of the scientists says, it's still your own child. You're just picking the very best version of your own child, which is kind of a mind fucking way, right? Because it helps sort of justify okay, why wouldn't I want to set my child up for success, to not have certain diseases, certain conditions? If I can eliminate suffering from their life, is that not my duty as a parent to do so? I think it challenges you a little bit to understand sort of the empathy side of this as well, which is ultimately we want to prevent human suffering and disease, right? And have all of us live our healthiest, most productive, sort of best lives. I think there's a interesting discussion around informed consent. One of the scariest parts of that movie, I think, is essentially that everyone at any moment is expected to sort of give up their DNA and prove who they are at the genomic level, right? You're stopped at work to give a blood sample or on the street to give a saliva sample. And what does that sort of mean? For us to get from here to there, obviously there would be much, tumultuousness that would occur, but still, as you mentioned, the forward progress of science and technology has essentially never stopped, right? We will always keep pushing forward. And so these things will continue to happen. I also think there are potentials for discrimination, just as there's discrimination on race or age or, gender or whatever it is now, we will unfortunately probably see people, genetically discriminated against based on, whether or not they have certain polymorphisms or whether or not they were a designer baby or they are an untouchable who is just kind of a natural godchild, as they talk about in that movie.
Yeah, it is absolutely crazy what the future holds and all the different possibilities for the gene editing and all 9 kinds of therapies that we still haven't even discovered yet. And boy, it's going to take a lot for me to deliver my blood sample just to get into someplace. So we'll see how that goes about. But really, the most important thing to take away from this conversation today is how we at Rebel Health and other doctors like guys in our practice are really taking some of this stuff, which kind of feels a little futuristic, and making it totally accessible to you. And the DNA test is here. It's now. You can analyze 800,000 SNPs, find out if you have propensity to certain diseases, what kind of mineral absorption rates do you have, what kind of sleep should you do, what kind of exercise best suits you. And you can really tailor a precision healthcare plan to your personal customized needs. And that's really a huge leap forward. So that's what we're doing at Rebel Health. And we know we're doing it a better way than they are in the mainstream. And eventually one day it may be available to everybody, but for now it certainly isn't. So stick around, listen to the videos on our channel, tune in to our social media profiles on Twitter, on Instagram, LinkedIn, across the board, Rebel Health, Jack Murphy, and Dr. Sandeep Palakodetti. And you should also check out this video right here where we go over why the U.S. healthcare system is so broken. Check that out, and I will see you in the next one.